Okay. Okay, so just to give us the overview again, like I said last week, it's really important to see the different parts of the, the teachings we're giving here in the framework of the bigger picture. It's always important to see that. I mean, if we've studied it enough, we would know it, but it's good to be reminded. So the whole path, as we know very well, Tsongkhapa, our 14th century lineage Lama, or maybe he didn't invent the term. I don't know where it's ever. I don't know its source. I do not know. But it's, as we know in Tibetan, it's lam rim, gradual path, path gradual. Well, I use the word course, which is a perfect term. It's a course. I mean, a course is a gradual path, isn't it? It's just that we don't use that term. We wouldn't say we're doing a gradual path of music or a gradual path of mathematics, but this is exactly what we're doing. It's a very tasty topic, a very tasty term. We call it a course. So obviously courses have stages, don't they? Well, they call these here the teachings, as Lama Zopa would put it, the teachings and practices suitable to the disciple of the least capability, which is a big mouthful. It's very accurate, and I'd like to call that junior school. I mean, it's kind of cliched, but it's very tasty because we know immediately say junior school, you recognize it means a level. If we say the teachings and practices suitable to the disciple of the least capability, it's a mouthful. We've got to get our head around it. What does he mean, Well, it's junior school, honey. And of course, the difference is, we tend to think of a little girl, a child, if we think of junior school, but it's not like that. We're talking about all adults. We're all adults here. Then you've got the middle scope. Then you've got the great scope. And then you have, so then I like to call it, then we've got this other analogy, which I think is just so perfect to help us understand the different qualities of practice, the different types of practice, and the wisdom wing and the compassion wing, and it totally works. So the wisdom wing and the compassion wing are the first two scopes, of junior school and high school, and then all the nuts and bolts of the teachings we need to employ, to comprehend, to practice, and internalize in order to put ourselves together, in order to stop ourselves from suffering. And with this understanding, we then go to the compassion wing and we start to realize that everybody's in the same boat. Everybody's suffering. And we now know what suffering is and we know why. And now we know it for others. And this is the basis now of compassion. And the thing is, it's incredibly important to understand that the level of compassion the Buddha is talking about, that we can cultivate, that culminates in this outrageous, attitude in the mind called bodhicitta, is such a more radical level of compassion that it's very hard for us to understand it. And it's impossible to understand it, even theoretically, until we've understood the first and second scopes, until we've understood the Four Noble Truths, until we've understood our suffering and the causes of our suffering and how to get rid of that suffering. So the only way to have the level of compassion that the Bodhisattvas have, which is compassion for every single tiny sentient being, not just the innocent victims, not just the poor, the suffering, and not just the ones that are suffering, what's called the suffering of suffering, but also those who've got the suffering of change and the suffering and all the all-pervasive suffering, which is what we learn about in the Four Noble Truths, these three levels of suffering. Because compassion is for everybody. Right now, the only compassion we tend to have is a person that we'd consider an innocent victim, or we see a child being abused, we'll have compassion for the child, and immediately we'll have anger for the abuser. That's just the logic. That's how we fit our compassion. We have to find out who's the blame. And that means then it leads to anger. It also can lead us, which is good, which is the point, to want to help. This is brilliant. But usually it's only the first kind of suffering. We don't rush around trying to help all the pedophiles. You don't set up organizations to help pedophiles. People would put you in prison and hate you as much as the pedophiles. This is a really important point. You don't set up organizations to help murderers and terrorists. No, we want to hate them, we want to blame them, and then we want them to suffer. Look at the world. I mean, look at your own mind, look at our mind. So it seems insane. What do you mean Bodhisattvas have compassion for pedophiles? It doesn't make any sense to us unless we understand the Four Noble Truths. Unless we understand the first of the Four Noble Truths, which is that there is suffering. So in other words, the whole point is that Buddha's understanding of suffering is far more subtle, far more subtle than what we think. And if we don't get that clear in the first and second scopes, then it's not possible to understand what bodhicitta is. And then it's not possible to understand these four perfections, these last six perfections. It's impossible. It just makes no sense. Just like if you leap into university level math, you'll be completely confused. You've got to have junior school and high school. It's so obvious. So I repeatedly say this. And this is a harder thing to see, because when we hear the teachings, we give them all kind of equal status. Well, in fact, we would think compassion is a lot easier than karma. We all like compassion and love. That's easy. No, you're completely mistaken. It's university level. Karma's junior school. Doesn't mean it's easy to understand, finally. Only finally when you're a Buddha will you understand all the intricacies of karma. But you start with it. So we've touched on this occasionally through our different talks. So here, there's 6 perfections. One way of putting it is that the first 4 are the kind of the finally, the perfecting and the perfecting of the wisdom wing, the compassion wing, the work we do in relation to others. So here, the Bodhisattva, having accomplished bodhicitta, is now bopping along life after life after life after life after life, gradually becoming a Buddha. And the process of doing that is practicing these first 4, the practice of generosity, the practice of the morality of benefiting others, the practice of patience, and the practice of perseverance. Then you've got the last 2, which is the perfection, if you like, of the wisdom wing, which is the work of getting concentration, single point of concentration, shamatha, which we talked about last week, and then realizing emptiness. So as we also talked last week, I think, it's important to remember in terms of the character of these different teachings, concentration is actually a Hindu teaching. It's not even a Buddhist teaching. Buddha didn't invent it. The Hindus did before him, these geniuses these genius yogis and great scholars that he studied with and practiced with before he diverged in his own direction, They're the ones who created more than 3,000 years ago this incredible technique that is still extant and living and being used and practiced every single day right now, in an unbroken chain of beings since 3,000 years, called single-pointed, generally known as single-pointed concentration. The specific technique is known as shamatha, calm abiding, which is a certain level of this single-pointed concentration. I'm sure we talked about it last week. And it's a level of mind that we don't even posit as existing in modern psychology and neuroscience, because it doesn't need a brain. It's a subtler level of mind. You go beyond the brain, beyond conceptuality, beyond the senses. And that does not even exist for us in science. I mean, maybe we're looking into it with all these amazing discussions with His Holiness the Dalai Lama these last 30 years. People are investigating these views coming from India now, We're starting to realize in the West that we're not the smartest people on the planet. Other people can be also smart and have come up with marvelous things that we haven't come up with yet. Very humbling for us. So single point of concentration is a Hindu technique, but it's taught in the path to enlightenment. Its character is that it's a middle scope teaching, because if you're on the Hinayana path, there's 2 main goals in Buddhism. They're both known as nirvana, the nirvana of your own liberation, and then the final nirvana of being a Buddha, the cessation of suffering. So the first one is, if you're, let's say, the Buddhism you'd study in Thailand or Burma, your goal would be to achieve your own liberation. You'd start with the first level of practice. You'd abide by the laws of karma. You'd live in vows. Then, you'd give up harming others because you don't want future suffering. And then you'd get to the deeper level and get into your mind and get renunciation and understand attachment and give up attachment. But then you would, get concentration, and then you'd realize emptiness, because emptiness also is a middle scope teaching, because you need emptiness to achieve liberation, which is the middle scope. So it's not in its nature a Mahayana teaching, but it's taught. These 2 are taught in the framework of the Mahayana path. After you've achieved bodhicitta. Because the thing is, I mean, Lama Yeshe, I'm sure we talked about this too, Lama Yeshe in his book Mahamudra talks about some of the qualities we would accomplish having accomplished shamatha. It just sounds like science fiction to us. It sounds impossible. It sounds insane. It's demented, because the view of the mind in Buddhism is so radically different. So that, I've heard it's like there's a danger, because the bliss you experience, the joy, the bliss, the unbelievable, extraordinary qualities that you'd accomplish having got single point of concentration and then realizing emptiness, it'll be very easy to forget about compassion. Whereas if you leave those 2 until later, until the final stages of the Mahayana path, and you get your bodhicitta first, then your bodhicitta, which is the phenomenal, outrageous, what drives the bodhisattvas, this unbelievable wish to never give up sentient beings because of their unbelievable, unbearable, as Lama Zopa calls it, unbearable compassion. So there's no way you're going to get sidetracked. Doesn't matter how much bliss you get, you're not going to forget sentient beings. So, we talked about single point of concentration. And so as Lama Yeshe points out in his Mahamudra book, which is just a variation of an approach to realizing emptiness, it is utterly impossible to to remove from the mind the subtlest delusion. The whole job of being a Buddhist all the way is control your body and speech, control the servants of the mind, the servants of the delusions, and then you start to control the branch delusions, attachment and aversion and all the others. And now we're getting to the root delusion, necessarily the subtlest, the most pervasive of all, and naturally the most hard to identify. We can learn to recognize attachment. We can learn to see this very specific quality that delusions have of distorting, of exaggerating the object that they cognize. It's fairly easy to identify when you're attached to chocolate cake, that the attachment embellishes the deliciousness of the chocolate cake. When you've got aversion for the ex-boyfriend, it's really evident, and it's not too difficult to see that our anger embellishes his ugly qualities. This is exactly the key function of all the delusions. But ego grasping, which is a name that's used colloquially to refer to this ignorance, this root delusion, when it's related to the self, this is much harder to recognize. It's much harder to see how this ego grasping embellishes the very ontological status itself of one's own being. This is much harder to recognize, much subtler. This is what we have to do here to achieve wisdom. The wisdom that sees now clearly how things exist, both conventionally and ultimately. So the combination of these 6 perfections is Buddhahood. So the name of this delusion is called ignorance. It's a very simple word, mahripa, unawareness. But it's a totally interesting one, as Holiness points out, that it's not, regular ignorance is really simple. If you say to me, what's that, Robina? Ordinary ignorance would be, I don't know. Now you think about this. It's a really interesting point, actually, in ordinary daily life. Let's say another one. Let's say you say, what's that, Robina? And I'll say, that's an Android phone. No, if I just say, I don't know, that's easy to fix. You'll just say that it's an iPhone, won't you? It's easy to fix. I have a space in my mind. I'm saying, I do not know what it is. This is simple, ordinary, common ignorance. And it's easy to fix it because there's nothing else in my mind interfering. And you tell me the truth and I'll say, thank you very much. And I'll check it out and I'll prove you're right. And I'll agree it's an iPhone. But what if I not only don't know it's an iPhone, but I've got a lie on top? And I believe it's an Android. Think like this. This is a very common way we do every single day. We live like this. We are lying to ourselves. We have ignorance all the time. And we don't even know that we don't know. And we don't know that we're believing in a lie. This is how all the delusions work. So not only do we not know that that cake can't make us happy, not only do we not know that the cake can't make us happy, we believe a lie, which is the exact opposite. That's the problem with this ignorance all the way through. So this ignorance, the root one, not only do we not know the ultimate way that things exist, that is to say they have no intrinsic nature, that's what we're going to be discussing. Not only do we not know that truth, not only are we ignorant of that, we believe the exact opposite. And that is why it's so painful, because we've got to rip we're believing in lies for eons. This is exactly how Buddha talks. It's quite unique to the Buddha. It's quite interesting. It's not, we hear all these words. You read this, you read all Asian, especially you read Eastern kind of spiritual, stuff. It's all about everything's an illusion. And we go, isn't that wonderful? Everything's an illusion. We haven't got a clue what we're talking about. We don't think it's literal. It is literal, but we can't understand it. So we mystify it, we fantasize it, we make it sound all la-di-da, Everything's an illusion, wow. I mean, Buddha's being precise, but we just can't hear it. We think it's romantic. So what does this, so if attachment over embellishes the deliciousness of something, and anger embellishes the ugliness of something, and, you know, depression is anger and it embellishes the ugliness of yourself. And, you know, every one of the delusions has its own particular function. And this is why we have to study Buddhist psychology. It's very precise. It's a real list of all these different states of mind and their particular function. And then we slowly have to use that as a basis to recognizing in our own mind, because they cause us suffering, you know. So how does this ignorance, what is its function? Like I said, they all exaggerate. They've all got that, as Lama Zopa said, all the delusions, this is such a lovely way to put it, all the delusions decorate on top of what is there, layers upon layers of characteristics that just aren't there. That's a brilliant way of putting what Buddha is saying, how all the delusions function, and we live in these functions. One of the terms that Lama Yeshe uses, and it's in Buddhist psychology, is the word superstition. Now you look at all the, let's say all the QAnon people now, when you look at it, you're dumbstruck. You can't believe these people believe in all these stories, isn't it? We really can't believe they believe in these. Well, Buddha's telling us we are all believing in some kind of fantasy. It's just a question of degree. So we believe a cake will make us happy. We believe our ex-boyfriend is the cause of our suffering. We believe that. Buddha says that's a lie. It's a superstition. It's just not true. We don't see the whole picture. So, but we're all delusional. We're all superstitious to some degree or another, Buddha is saying, you know, just some more extreme than others. And that's what ignorance that causes. That's why, and that's what causes all the suffering on the planet and the universe. That's why people harm each other. This is a tragedy. This is what being in samsara means. Believing in all these lies. And this is why we suffer. These are why we suffer. And this is really hard to hear. It sounds far too simple. The reason we suffer is because we believe the stories our delusions tell us. So in other words, if you believe, this seems far too simple, but this is literally what Buddha is saying. If you believe a $5 note is $50, it's a very simple example. If you believe a $5 note is 50, then you'll always be disappointed, won't you? Because you'll have expectations. You'll see it for what it's not. You'll go out there with all these expectations, and then you always get disappointed when you only get $5 worth. That's how we spend our lives. We're always being bumping into reality because our attachment, anger, depression, anxiety, worry, they're all liars. It's really hard to hear this, but this is literally their main function, and this is why we suffer, because we're not in touch with reality. It sounds so abstract because it's about the last thing would ever occur to us to think of why we're suffering, because we believe in lies. It sounds hilarious. This is exactly what Buddha is saying. So here we're dealing with the deepest lie, the root lie. So this ignorance, okay, as I said, it embellishes the very ontological status of things. The very existence of things at their core. So when you study Buddhist psychology, Buddhist philosophy, you first learn all the terms that for what exists. There's various synonyms for that which exists. One is the word phenomenon, another is the word object, another is the word object of knowledge, another one is existent, another one is established base. These are all synonyms for that which exists. So why are we learning this? Because Buddha's telling us right now, we're living in la-la land and we're believing in things that don't exist. A chocolate cake that'll make you happy doesn't exist. A boyfriend that you think is the main cause of your suffering does not exist. That object does not exist. The boyfriend exists, but not the boyfriend you think is there. That's the way to put it. The cake does exist, a conventional, but not the cake we think is there, because it's seen through the lenses of our lies. The whole universe is seen like this, you know. So first we have to establish what exists and what doesn't. And so there's one of the best ways Tsongkhapa always praises is he praises Buddha's teachings on it. There's this marvelous song, you know, song of experience of Tsongkhapa in praise of the Buddha for his teachings on dependent arising. So the king of logics, as Lama Yeshe puts it, paraphrasing Buddha, the king of logics, to prove emptiness is dependent arising. So there's a way of putting this is that we see things in the framework of what they call the two truths. Everything that exists, every phenomenon, every object of knowledge, every existent, every established base, every phenomenon, excuse me, has a way of has a conventional way of existing and has an ultimate way of existing. It's a way of putting it, okay? The two truths, conventional, ultimate. So the term for how things exist conventionally is they exist interdependently. They exist in dependence upon various factors. They exist as dependent arisings. Use it as a noun. Everything that exists, every phenomenon, every object of knowledge, every existent is a dependent arising. And that's the so then if we want to try and understand the ultimate way that those phenomena exist, we first establish what it is conventionally. We've all got to be on the same page. So you have to define something, label it and define it, and we all agree. So what's that? Well, I say to Mummy, well, darling, you know, sweetheart, that's called a thermos, let's say. And then she has to tell me, but then I'll say natural, I'll say, what is it? And what I'm really saying about this is very interesting. When I say what is it, what I'm meaning is, what is its meaning? What does it do? What is its function? These are hugely important words to understand how things exist in Buddhism. Well, sweetheart, so she'll give me the definition. And you can say that a definition has two parts. The first part tells you its conventional characteristics. It allows you to recognize it. It's a flat-bottomed metal container. I'll get that. But I'm not happy yet. I don't know what it does yet, do I? I have to know its meaning. What's its real meaning? What's its function? What does it do? What's its job? Oh, sweetheart, it holds my tea. It keeps it warm. Now, I should not believe her. And this is our trouble. We believe anybody. Don't believe her. She has to prove it to me. We're trying to establish something as existing. Establish it. We have to make it real. We're talking conventional here. So she'll tell me. So what she'll do is, she'll put the lid on it, and then she'll put her tea in it, put the lid on. We'll come back in 2 hours. No, I'll say the second part, what's its job? It keeps my tea hot. Well, don't just believe her. So she's got to put her lid on it and keep the tea in there, and then 2 hours later come back, and then she'll take the lid off, and we will prove together that it did fulfill the function. It keeps my tea hot. So far, so good. Still not enough yet analysis to do. Still not enough to be satisfied. You've got to now check in this world that we live in, like within our conventional reality, is there another definition, another term, another definition of this very thing that contradicts that? And if there's not, then you tick the box, shake hands, and now we all agree what a thermos is. This is what we have to establish. We're trying to be useful here, intelligent, or be on the same page. And right now, we not only don't even know the ultimate way that things exist, we're living in the lies of the fantasy. We don't even understand the conventional way things exist. We see them through the lies, through the distortion of our disturbing emotions, you know. We make up things. So anyway, there we go. We establish a thermos. Now let's look at the other phenomenon. Let's look at the phenomenon called me. So the term me, self, I, myself, all these terms, person, they're all synonymous. We're one of those. We're an example of those. Buddha is an example of those. An ant is an example of those. A dog, a hungry ghost, a hell being, if we can establish those beings exist. They're persons, they're I's, they're selves, they're me's. Simply conventionally. So me is a term that refers to a person. So we're one of those. So let's look at emptiness in terms of how we cling, how ignorance causes us to misconceive the me. Because that's the tasty one, isn't it? Well, Buddha's telling us there are 3 levels. There are millions of levels of dependent arising, but there are 3 in particular that he uses as arguments with the prevailing views before him. So one view, the very first one, and we can learn this about karma in terms of the self. The self isn't the product of a creator. The self isn't the product of mummy and daddy, and the self isn't just the body. You know, the self is the term we use to refer to the combination of body and mind, and the main cause of that self is my past actions. So, you know, when you start to learn karma, the law of cause and effect, this is an example of the first level of dependent arising, that I exist in dependence upon causes from the previous mind of mine. So when this starts to loosen the grip of ego grasping, you start to feel less self-pity, you start to blame less, you start to take more account, more responsibility for who you are, because you realize you're the product of your past causes. This is a really helpful way to start to loosen the grip of ego grasping already. Karma is a marvelous example of the first level dependent arising. Now we'll go to the second level. In other words, the first level of dependent arising the Buddha teaches, which is arguing with a previous view of the Hindus, is that there's some kind of self that is not caused. So then the second one is that this ignorance, a subtler level of dependent arising, he says this ignorance causes us to believe 1,000,000,000% that in here somewhere, along with all the other bits and pieces, all the other parts, in here somewhere is a particular part, a very special part that kind of runs the show. And that part is called I. We believe that. Our language expresses it. It's so totally instinctive. We haven't learned it. We come into this world believing it, and everything we think and do and say reiterates it, reaffirms it. There's two major mistakes, and this is the first one. The other mistake is we think all of it, all of me is me, all the parts are me. We have to argue with both of those mistakes because Buddha says both are not true. So let's look at that mistake. And the example these days I'm using is you go to IKEA, you know. There's Andrew and he wants to buy an Andrew. He looks up IKEA and he sees this nice, handsome guy and he wants to buy one. So he goes to IKEA and he's very disappointed, of course, because they'll give him a bloody box, won't they? Full of what? Millions of parts. He'd be very shocked. He's got to build his own damned Andrew, isn't it? Think about this. But this is a really good example how I is existing in dependence upon its parts, and that among all those millions of parts that Andrew's going to find in that box labeled Andrew, there won't be a part called I, or Andrew in his case. The name of his I is Andrew. The name of your I is whoever you are. So this is a really good example because this is doing the opposite. What we have to do when we do the meditation on emptiness is, because there was no IKEA at the time of the Buddha, you had to unpack the parts of the I looking for it. But we've already done that. IKEA's designed Andrew and then got all the millions of bits and pieces and put them conveniently into a big box. It's a really good analysis to do. So first of all, we know that in that box there'll be very specific parts. And IKEA already know what they've built. They've designed the Andrew. They know exactly the number of parts and they chuck them all in there. So they won't put in sort of 5 legs and 3 thumbs. They're going to have the exact number of correct parts. And each part will have a function. Think about this. Each part will have its own function exactly. When you buy that table, it'll tell you there are 17 screws, 3 of this size, 2 of that size, and each one belongs in a certain position. This is a really powerful way to look at it. Each part has its function. Each part specifically, and if there are even 10,000 parts in that box of Andrew, and there very well might be even more, every single one of those pieces will have its proper job. Isn't it? We understand this. So as Andrew's building the Andrew, he's going to start to panic because what he's waiting to find is the particular part that's called I, because we all believe without that piece, there is no Andrew. But you won't find one. This is what Buddha's telling you. You won't find a piece. You're going to find millions of other pieces. And the point is this: there is no a piece that's independent of the other pieces that's called I, such that when it's there, I functions. Not like that. You won't find one, Buddha says, and you don't need one, because all the parts, all working together, doing their job, function perfectly as Andrew. Because finally, Andrew is the name we give to that combination of parts. We can hear this. We can hear it. We do the same with a table. I remember it was the very first example I heard Lama Yeshe use when I first went to when I first teaching. And I remember staring, he was talking about the table, and I was infuriated. He was talking about there's no table here. Where's the table? It's exactly the same thing. We think there's a little tableness in there, but we do. Or even, look at this, it's really simple. My thermos has a base. Now, without analysis, that's a true statement, isn't it? The thermos has a base. It's a true statement. There's the base, look. It's a fact. Without analysis, you say but you've got to analyze. Because in the same way that we believe there's an intrinsic little me in here, we believe there's an intrinsic thermos somehow here, but you take the base away, There's the base. Take it away. What you have is a piece of round metal, isn't it? But what do you have in this hand? You don't have a thermos. You can't find a thermos. You take the sides away, there's a part called the sides. You take the top away, there's the top. You take the base away, there's not many parts for a thermos, it's only 3. You don't have a thermos, there's no thermos there. Thermos is the label you give to those 3 parts. It's very straightforward. Everything's like that. But we've been clinging for eons and eons and eons, Buddha says, into the belief that there is in here an intrinsic peace. And this is the assumption of the Christians. It's the assumption, they call it a soul. The assumption of the Jews, they call it a soul. The assumption of the Hindus, they call it an Atman. The assumption of the Muslims, they call it a soul. The Greeks call it an essence. We in modern psychology call ourselves ego. We never even analyze what the ego is. We don't even analyze it in our culture. We just take it as an assumption of truth that there is an I in there, you know. We don't even analyze it. At least the others analyze it and give it a name, because this mistake is so absolute. And this is a gross understanding. It's not even a subtle understanding. So, you know, this way we're trying to establish what is true, what is real, what exists and what doesn't, conventionally. So we'll make a statement. I'll make a statement, you know. I'll make a statement. I have a thermos and a phone. So if I'm speaking the truth, think about this. If I'm speaking the truth, if the words that come out of my mouth, which are an expression of the thoughts in my mind, are accurate, this is conventional reality, then you need to count the number of phenomena I just said. Well, I said 3, didn't I? I is one phenomenon, thermos is the second phenomenon, and phone is the third phenomenon. If I make the statement, I have a phone and a thermos, you have to prove it's true. And that means you have to count 3 things. This is really reasonable. So I'll make another statement. I have a nose and an ear. So again, like the thermos, without analysis, that's a fact. But let's do the analysis. So how many phenomena did I mention? It's clear. I mentioned 3. I is one phenomenon. No, don't even point. I is one phenomenon. It's a noun. Phenomena are like nouns, you know. The mind cognizes nouns. So I is a noun, ear is a noun, and nose is a noun. So that's 3 phenomena. So the nose we can point out, there it is. The ear we can point out pretty quick. And now the tricky bit comes, isn't it? Where's the third phenomenon? This is the point. Where's the third phenomenon that isn't the ear and isn't the nose? Because if it's either, this is this whole analysis, they call it, if something exists, it's either one or more than one. So you know, if you have to find 3 things, and the I has to be something that isn't the other 2. Obvious. It goes without saying. This is the discussion we have to do. What is the phenomenon? Because this is how we talk. I is the owner of the ear. So we have to find the I, and that's how we feel. You know, my ear, we will say. The my is a word referring to the I, the owner. And we believe there is an owner, and we believe there's an ear. This is so utterly automatic and instinctive, isn't it? And it's always somewhere around here. We're never quite sure where it is. So in the same way that, this is the other thing, these 3 phenomena, this is a very simple example. They are both separate from each other and they're independent of each other. They're separate and they're different. They're separate and they're different. So in other words, if my thermos breaks, my phone is untouched because it doesn't depend. They're independent of each other. The thermos doesn't depend upon the existence of the phone to its function, to hold my tea hot. If Robina drops dead, the thermos and the phone will keep doing their jobs. So they're 3 independent, and in this case also different phenomena. Now, the Robina and the ear and the eye is more subtle. The ear, so okay, one more thing. Just to make the point, if the thermos breaks, like I said, the phone's intact and the phone won't mind. It won't get upset because it has no relationship with the thermos, no relationship. So now, if the ear stops working, if you punch me in the ear, my ear, there's going to be pain located here, isn't there? I mean, there's pain located here, but my nose is fine, isn't it? My nose will still be able to breathe. In a simple sense, they're separate and they're independent of each other. Okay, finally, we look at the whole body. They all depend, blah, blah, blah. But a simple thing in terms of the ear being functioning to hear and the nose functioning to breathe. The ear can be cut off. My nose will be fine. So if there were a third piece called I in here, and then you punch my ear, I will say, how dare you punch me? I will say. And you'll say, Robina, I didn't punch you. I punched your ear. So if there were a separate I, if there were, which is how we think, it wouldn't mind when the ear got punched. It'll go, phew, I'm glad it's not me that got punched. Poor ear. This is a fact. If there were a separate I, it would be independent. It could fly off and run away and leave your ear and your nose in peace. But there isn't one, Buddha says. And you don't need one. You don't need a separate independent I. There can't be such a thing anyway. There can't be. But the point is here, it gets more nuanced. There is an I, but not separate. But it's different. The eye is not the ear, but you can't separate them. So this is more subtle because they're utterly dependent on each other. The eye and the ear are utterly interdependent, but they're different. The eye is not the ear. It is not the nose, but you can't separate them. So it's a more subtle analysis, this one. And this is the type of analysis we have to do. It sounds like kind of intellectual and boring, but this is exactly what we have to do, because ego grasping, ignorance is completely hysterically emotional, believing in absolute nonsense. But we're so used to it, we can't even hear the lie that it's telling us, This is not the subtlest. We've got more work to do. Any questions so far about what I just discussed? If there's not, I'll keep going. I mean, it sounds very boring. It sounds kind of smarty pants, doesn't it? But this is the only way you're going to break down. It's the only way you're going to have to break down lies. Like, in other words, if I believe Andrew stole from me, think about this. If I totally believe Andrew stole from me, and the fact is he didn't, he can't just tell me, Robina, I didn't steal from you. He's got to prove it, doesn't he? Think about this. He can't just say, oh, Robina, I didn't. Oh, didn't you, darling? Oh, thank you very much. I'd be pretty smart if I could believe him immediately, because I won't believe him, because I've built up this entire story. I've got a complete narrative in my head. With absolute certainty he stole from me. So he's not going to just shout and yell, I didn't do it. He has got to argue with each of my parts of my narrative. Think about this. He's got to argue with each part of my narrative, proving at each point how I'm wrong. That's what we have to do with ego grasping. Argue in 100 different ways with this misconception. Finally prove, using wisdom, to argue with ego's ridiculous misconceptions. And because the lies are so deeply ingrained, because we so totally believe that there is an independent I, it takes quite a while. And the final point is, you can't finally realize this until you get to the subtle level of single point of concentration. The grosser level of mind is not capable of realizing it. We've got to start there. Well, like we're doing right now, we're talking intellectually. That's why I've got to use logic and analysis to debate with it. It's not just being clever. It's not just being intellectual. It's absolutely necessary. And that's why we have to learn the term. Like I said last, we have to learn the terminology. Can't just say words and hope some realization will come. It's just ridiculous. Any questions? Nothing. Yes, Eileen. What's happening? Just a minute. What's happening on Erin's phone? Erin, what's going on there? What are you doing? I can't. It's weird. You're making me. What's happening? What's happening, Erin? Can't hear you, darling. Can't hear you. Can't hear you. Can't hear you. What's happened? Go on. Tell me. Go on. Are you okay, Erin? Not talking to me. Never mind. Are you okay? Because all this strange movement. Maybe you just turn your video off if you don't want to. If you don't want to be sitting there, might be best for everybody. But that's better. And then you can do what you like, darling, and you can listen as well. But if you want to sit there, absolutely, I'd love to see your face. Before I couldn't see your face. There you go. You decide, sweetheart. What's best? So come on. Yes, Eileen. What's your question?
So, Venerable Robina, when you're reading the Dharma and they talk about this ignorance, this is basically the root ignorance. Then,
yeah, that's right, precisely.
That this is the
root
core.
Okay, generally they use the ignorance to refer to just in general being ignorant of karma, ignorant of this and that. But
yes.
this is the root ignorance, the root delusion. Yes,
Right.
Exactly.
And the reason why it's the root ignorance is because if I see something as separate, including I have this I, then this I is...
What's one of the functions of so it's the root delusion because it's the most subtle, and it's the one that is the cause. And because one of the functions of this ignorance is to have this sense of a separate I. Exactly. That's one of the biggest lies. When you're finally a Buddha, Eileen, there's no longer a sense of a separate self, which is a pretty abstract concept. It sounds very cosmic to us, but it's quite literally true. So that on the basis of the ignorance positing a separate I, which is totally rooted in fear, then the next voice that comes is this massive attachment to get what that fantasy I wants. And then the next one that comes after that is this aversion and panic and anger when the attachment doesn't get what it wants. They're all utterly linked to each other in a very intricate psychological way. So, first you've got to control the servants of the attachment and the anger. Then you control the attachment and the anger. And now we get to the root of the problem and rid the mind of the root lie. Therefore, there's no longer any fear. There's no longer any basis for attachment or anger or jealousy and the anxiety and all the other rubbish. They're all gone. There's no basis for them because you've cut the root.
Interesting, yeah.
Isn't it?
So when we're working with trying to control the servants of the mind, we're still thinking that we have an I in a way.
Well, no, the servants of the I, what I meant by that is the body and the speech. That's the first
body and speech.
Control your body and speech. It's junior school, entry level. Don't kill, don't steal, don't jump on the wrong partner, don't eat too many bits of cake. You got to control the crazy servants of the attachment and the anger. Then you get to the branch delusions in the second scope, and you start to get renunciation by understanding attachment and how it is the source of all the other dramas. And now we get to the root that's even the source of attachment itself. So it's progressive. Do you understand?
Thank you. Thank you.
Good. Yes, Eileen. Wonderful. Thank you. What else, people? So, okay, let's look at different ways of seeing all this. Is the use of the words, for example. This is where this word emptiness gets us really, really confused. So the way we're talking here is using the words. When we've started to understand this level of dependent arising, we will conclude, therefore, there is no independent I. There's no I independent of the parts. That I is empty of existing independently of the parts. That's the way to say emptiness comes in. So then, and this is not the subtlest. So now let's look at the word emptiness, because this gets us completely confused. Like we said before, the mind, when we learn Buddhist philosophy, you learn the words to refer to that which exists. And there are different kinds of phenomena. There are some obvious, evident phenomena, things we can see with our senses, like the shape and color and different things. The ordinary impermanent phenomena that exist, trees and computers and moons and stars and cushions and things like that. Conventional phenomena. They're all these impermanent phenomena. It's easy we can kind of understand they are phenomena. We can label it, define it. It functions, so we can talk about a cushion, a thermos, a lamp, etc. Now you have other kinds of phenomena that are a bit more abstract. And these, so for example, you could say, I could pick up my thermos, about to drink, and I go, oh, my thermos is empty, I'll say, won't I? And we know it means of whatever I drink, tea or something, isn't it? If you're going to a hotel, to a party, and you're looking, or an event, I'm thinking of an event, and all these different rooms with people in them, and you're looking for this particular group, and you're expecting all the people to be in room 7, and you open the door and you go, oh, the room's empty. You mean of people. You think you're looking forward to spending your $5,000, and you open up your bank account and you see 0, and you go, oh my God, my bank account is empty. We say like that. We talk this way. We understand it. So let's turn. So then what we're doing is our mind is cognizing something, isn't it? Our mind's always cognizing. And like I said before, the mind cognizes things as nouns, as things, as phenomena. So what is our mind cognizing when I go, oh, my cup is empty? My mind just cognized a phenomenon called the absence of tea. This is not being smart. This is quite literal. So there is, in other words, there is a phenomenon. If there were tea in my cup, then I could cognize the phenomenon called tea. If there's no tea in my cup and I'm expecting tea, then what I'm going to cognize is the absence of tea. So there's another phenomenon. There's one phenomenon called tea, but there's another phenomenon in my case that I'm cognizing when I'm expecting my tea, and it's called the absence of tea. That's a very true statement. Well, another word for absence is emptiness. I just cognized the phenomenon, more abstract. It is definitely an abstract phenomenon. I just cognized the phenomenon, the object, the existent, called absence of tea. When you can get your head around this, you can begin to understand what Buddha's referring to when he talks about, he's not discussing the emptiness of tea, obviously, or the emptiness of people, or the emptiness of dollars. He is discussing the emptiness of an independent I. So emptiness is not just one of the biggest, commonest mistakes over history, it seems, in the interpretation of Buddha's teachings and our own understanding. The commonest mistake is to think it means nothingness. Nihilism. This is the worst mistake. Falling into the abyss of the great mistake, as Tsongkhapa says, It doesn't refer to nothingness. So listen to this. Listen. Andrew thinks there's $5,000 in his bank. So he's got an expectation. And this is something that's really crucial. The only person who will see the absence of $5,000 in his bank, the only person who will see the absence of tea in their cup, the only person who will see the absence of people in that room, think about this, is the person who expects them. Think about this. If Andrew knew there was nothing in his bank, or $47, he wouldn't be surprised when he opened up the bank account, because his expectation is in sync with reality. But if he's got an expectation of $5,000 and he sees a 0, he will have a panic attack. If I expect tea, but I meet emptiness of tea, I'll have a panic attack. These are unhappy emptinesses. But think of a good emptiness. Like, you think you've got cancer. You're preparing to die. You're letting go of your husband, your children, all the trauma, the drama, the horror, the freaking out. You go through all this emotional, psychological, panic, because you believe you've got cancer. And you go to the doctor and she said, oh, I made a mistake. I gave you the wrong x-rays. You don't have cancer. You just had a powerful realization of the phenomenon called the emptiness of cancer in my body. Think about this. Now, I don't have cancer. So when I'm told I don't have cancer, I go, yeah, I know. Nothing special. But if I believe I've got cancer and then I'm told I haven't got it, what I've just realized is the absence of cancer. If I believe there's tea in my cup and when I discover there isn't, I'll discover the absence of tea. When I believe there's $5,000 in my bank and I discover there's nothing there, I just discovered the absence of $5,000. I mean, the point of this emptiness, and when the greatest yogis discover that there isn't and never has been and never could be an independent I there, when they first discover that emptiness, this is just complete bliss. So when I'm talking about emptinesses that are miserable, like no tea, no people, no $5,000, no cancer is a nice one. That's a good example. But to get the idea, get your head around the idea, we're all the time doing this, you know. We're expecting something, and then when you discover it's not there, that's the absence of something, and it's a real phenomenon. You just cognized a real phenomenon called the absence of tea. You said, oh, my cup's empty. Another way of putting it, I've just realized there is no tea in my cup. Another way of putting it, I just realized the absence of tea in my cup. It's just a way of putting it. But that's the way you've got to try and get your head around, this abstract way of saying emptiness of something. It's not just playing with words, it's powerful. Because in subtle concentration, after eons of practice or hard work or whatever, and you do all your analysis, all the breaking down, all the dramas, and you've got concentration, and one day after much analysis, much dependent arising, much purification, one day at some point, exactly at 30 seconds past 1 p.m. on Friday, the 2nd of January, 2027, you will see for the first time, nakedly, that there never has been, isn't, and never could be an independent I. You just at that second cognize the emptiness of the independent I. You just saw the truth that there never has been, isn't, and never could be that I. That's like the second that the doctor tells you you haven't got cancer. You just discovered the truth that there never has been that cancer. Now, there could be cancer, there could be tea, there could be money, and there could be people, but there can never, never, never be an independent I. So it's a much more radical absence. What I'm getting here is the use of the word emptiness to get your head around the use of it. That's all. It's extremely important. Are we communicating? Lou has a question.
If there's no independent I, then what gets reborn is not I.
No, there's a conventional I, Lou.
Okay.
But it's just, as Lama Zopa puts it, in other words, but right from where before we established, we have to have a conventional I before we recognize on that conventional I the absence of an inherent I, the absence of an independent I. So there's always going to be an I, but as Lama Zopa puts it, what does exist is so subtle, it's as if it doesn't exist. And that's the tricky part, because right now we've got the two extreme views. Whenever we hear there is no independent I, we go, and that's implicit in your question, then what gets reincarnated, as you just said, because you're hearing, if there is no independent I, you're hearing it as no I. That's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. That's going to an extreme. So to say there's not an atom of an I from the side of Lou's aggregates is a statement of fact, but we hear it in a distorted, exaggerated, extreme nihilistic way. So the right way to hear it is there is not, from the side of the aggregates, from the side of Lou's body and mind, which are the pieces that make up Lou, there's not an atom of Lou there, but and then we hear that, and we want to hear there's no Lou, but don't hear that. Then when we hear dependent arising Lou, that there is a Lou that does exist in dependence upon this and that. And as soon as we hear that, we go, oh, thank God, there is something after all, grasp. So here we over-exaggerate Lou, and here we under-exaggerate Lou. These are the two extremes that our mind spontaneously goes between, because this is a function of this ego grasping, to hear it like that. So when we can begin to understand, even intellectually, that when we hear there is no independent Lu, we've got to train our mind to say, ha ha, that means there is a dependent arising Lu. And then as soon as we hear, ha ha, there's a dependent arising Lu, we go, ha ha, that means there is no independent Lu. So then we're bringing the two truths together. We're going in the right direction. We've got to train our minds to think this way. Then you're on the right track. And then eventually we'll realize the meaning of it, because right now it just sounds puzzling. It's sort of like make up your mind Buddha. Is there an I or isn't there, because we can't hear it together integrated. But when we start to understand dependent arising and emptiness are the flip sides of the same coin, we are really on the right track. So the I does reincarnate, but the part of the I that reincarnates is the mind. Put it like that.
Okay. So in essence, the dependent arising I is not my mind.
No, exactly not. It's the name we give to the combination of the mind and the physical energy. And in the tantric view, there is a subtle physical energy. So they're the basis of the label I. The basis of the label I, exactly. The thermos is not the metal pieces. Thermos is the label for the pieces. Thermos is the name we give to the pieces. Lu is the label. I is the label we give to the combination of body and mind. And the subtle body and subtle mind, subtle body is like the wind energy. They combine, they continue on from life to life.
Okay.
But whatever exists is always empty. Whatever it is, whatever phenomenon we're discussing, we can say the same words about it. There is no intrinsic mind. There's no intrinsic aggregates. There's no intrinsic air. There's no intrinsic karma. They're all empty. That's what we have to keep remembering as well. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes, Marilyn, darling.
Hi. Last week you wrote, I think I'm understanding this a little bit better today. You read that Lama Yeshe wrote, it's difficult to realize non-duality because our minds are so thick. We need to cut the dualistic point of view.
Yes.
So then I'm assuming from today that you're referring to cutting the root delusion.
Yeah.
And then, but I understand dualism like from the Christian. It's a separation from God, but
here the dualism, the final dualism is there's many levels of duality in Buddhism. There's me and you and him and her and within ourself, when we finally reach the non-duality of the final non-duality, when we've realized emptiness, there's no sense of a separate I, there's no sense of subject object, all of these things. Everything is dualistic at different levels. So it's a similar attitude. It's a bit similar to that idea, the Christian one, but more subtle than that.
Okay.
So another way of non-duality is when we realize emptiness. Another term for emptiness is non-duality. And Mahamudra in that context is a term used to refer to non-duality, to refer to emptiness. When we've cut the root and no longer the up and down and you and me and good and bad, all the other business, it's like,
okay.
Yeah. But
so is there a word in Buddhism for a God? Like, I know it's not the creator kind of interpretation. Is it more just consciousness?
Buddha
Okay.
Buddha mind.
Okay.
I mean, this is what I always often talk. I mentioned when years ago in Melbourne, which is where I'm born, the Catholic University there asked me to give a little talk. And I just had this 20-minute slot. I remember the morning I got there, I still didn't know what I was going to talk about. So I looked up the definition in the Merriam-Webster dictionary of the word God. And it said 3 essential qualities: infinite wisdom, infinite compassion, and infinite power. Well, they're exactly the same qualities that the Buddhism would describe are the qualities of a person who becomes a Buddha. They have the same characteristics. Your mind pervades the universe. Your mind knows everything. Your mind has infinite compassion, and your mind has infinite power. But the difference is in Christianity, that's only one person, and that's called God. And then we become oneness with that. But the Buddha says every one of us can become that one. We actually become our own Buddha. And so, of course, it's the same also when you are Buddha and I am Buddha. There's essentially just one Buddha. That's the Buddha mind, the subtle Buddha mind that's all pervasive, all knowing, all seeing, all compassionate. That's the difference between the Christian teachings and the Buddhist teachings. Shocking. It's like a sin of pride to say this from the Christian point of view. I mean, my talk was a similarity between the definition of God and Buddha. I don't know how the Catholics liked it or not, but That was my talk, because it's exactly the same. The difference is the Christians say that is separate and it's above and it's the creator of everything else. But for the Buddha, we don't need that because we create ourselves.
Mhm.
Do you understand, Marilyn?
Yeah, yeah.
Right. What else, people? Erin has a question. Talk to me, Erin.
Hi,
Please.
Venerable.
Hello, John.
I wanted to ask about emptiness, and this thought occurred to me because I was in a gardening class, and I think there's a poem that when we were in school we learned about only God could make a tree and all this stuff, and
yeah.
I can't remember, it was a Robert Frost or somebody like that.
Yeah,
but
right.
What they were talking about was these processes within plants that involve enzymes or I think it's enzymes that cause, when they're stimulated by sunlight, then the growth happens and then the leaves unfold. I mean, it's quite magical and wonderful. Yes. Not
exactly.
Magical, but wonderful.
I understand.
But
yeah.
Would that be sort of like emptiness? Because there's no need for a God to create the tree. There's like the tree is unfolding because it's the automatic.
It's a tree is a good example of dependent arising. It's made up of millions of different parts and they all do their job, and suddenly, before you know it, this tree manifests out of all those millions of parts. That's dependent arising. Everything exists like that. Everything is this process, and that's why the Buddha's view is that's the view of karma when it comes to the process that makes a person. And we don't need to be created by somebody else. There's no intrinsic me that's made by somebody else. We are the product of our own past process. It's exactly like that. That's dependent arising. And that's the example of karma as a good example of that process for a person. We create ourselves moment by moment and life to life. Do you understand?
Yeah, there doesn't need to be
a boss.
Something making it all happen that
No,
has a separate
that's the major difference the Buddha makes. Absolutely. This is the major difference between Islam, Christianity, and that's where it's shocking. If you said this to a Muslim, it's a very shocking thing to say. That's why the Muslims always put it, everything is so brilliant, you must have an architect. Buddha disagrees. Dalai Lama calls karma self-creation. We all are we're the product of this very process, every one of us, Erin. And that's why we better got to be in charge of this process, because we're creating ourselves.
Well, how about the systems that are like the planets and the physics and all these things that don't have
consciousness? That's a good point. It's a bit more abstract, but it's very fascinating. There are four ways. See, what the boss in the Buddhist view of the universe, the boss is individual minds, and exactly everything we do, every being, whatever we think and do and say, because go back a bit. In the Vajrayana model of the universe, which is very interesting, there is matter, which is made of the four elements, and then there is minds. That's it. And there's an intimate relationship at a subtle level, the Dalai Lama says. There's an intimate relationship. We've got gross body and we have gross mind that goes along. That's a sensory consciousness. But we've got this subtle level of physicality, which is this subtle nervous system. And then within all those thousands of different channels running through our body, and this is similar to the Ayurvedic system, it's similar to the Chinese system, it's the Tibetan medical system, and it's the Vajrayana system. And all our different states of mind are coursing through all these 72,000 channels, intimately, inextricably linked to their own wind energies, prana. So the universe is made of the four elements. This is the same matter as a mountain or a planet or a flower or a tree. It's the four elements. So what causes these four elements to be the shape that they are is the actions that we have done in past lives with our mind. So we produce the body we get. But one of the ways our past karma ripens is called environmental karma. So even the way the physical world manifests, it's coming from the past actions from millions of lifetimes of all the individual beings who are experiencing the universe. So the whole universe is the product of past actions of the mind, of billions of minds over billions of eons, not some creator who makes it all. Do you understand that? So, even so, you get born in a certain life and you got allergies and everything that the physical world harms you. That's the fruit of past killing. So even any way the physical world impacts upon us Even if we see galaxies and whatever, the way we even interpret it and see it, all this physical matter is manifesting in a particular way according to our karma. There's no creator, and it's not merely physical laws. There can't just be merely physical. There are physical laws, but what runs all of it is eons and eons of minds all doing different things, which is the law of karma. Does that make sense?
It does. It's a little mind-boggling
It is.
to.
I know it's hilarious, but it's all there in the literature. You know, it's up to us to look into this. It's very fascinating. I agree with you totally, Erin. I agree. It's fascinating. Thank you, sweetheart. Wonderful questions. What else, people? So the okay, let's look at the Heart Sutra. It's very interesting. This is this business of the two truths, you know, and the biggest mistake we make is there's either nothing or there's something. They're the two extremes. They're the view of nihilism, there's nothing, or there's a view of eternalism, which is the view there is something intrinsic and permanent and real. We have these two extremes, and even emotionally we go between these two. They're related to attachment and kind of depression. You know, you think about it. When everything's being gorgeous and divine, we're grasping at something. When everything collapses, we want to kill ourselves. You know. All our emotions are linked to these misconceptions in our minds. So the big thing we got to see is that these dependent arising and emptiness aren't contradictory. They're the flip sides of the same coin. Like I said, when we can begin to even intellectually comprehend this, we're on the right track. If we're seeing them as separate, we're in serious trouble, you know. So in the Heart Sutra, Lord Buddha, you know, there he is sitting there in meditation. This is a common way he gave his teachings. He sat there in meditation, blissing out, and then he channels his thoughts into the minds of his disciples. So in this case, it's Shariputra and 10th level Bodhisattva Avalokitesvara having a conversation. And they're basically speaking Buddha's words. It's his teaching, but they're speaking the words. And so as we know, what it is, you know, is just really a presentation of all the different categories of phenomena according to the Buddhist view of the universe. And he's saying how each of these things is empty. So as we know, in the first one, he's taking the 5 aggregates, and he's the first of the 5 aggregates, the 5 pieces that make up a person. The first one is form, which is really the physicality. So he says form is emptiness. Form is empty. Emptiness is form. Form is nothing other than emptiness, and emptiness is nothing other than form. What he's saying is that wherever you find anything, in this case it could be form, it could be I, it doesn't matter, whatever phenomenon exists, you would, to spell it out, what Buddha's saying is, the dependent arising I is emptiness of independent I. So wherever you find an interdependent I, you're going to find right there with it, the characteristic called emptiness of independent I. You can't find an interdependent I without finding at the same time the emptiness of an independent I, because they're basically the two truths and they're just the flip sides of the same coin. So where there is the existence of an interdependent I, you will find right there the emptiness of an independent I. So interdependent I is absence of independent I. And then emptiness of independent I is the same as the opposite. So in other words, they're two together. You can't have one without the other. You can't have one truth without the other. They're not opposite. They're different ways of putting the same truth. Put it like that. They're different. Interdependence, you know, is different, but they're like the flip sides of the same coin. So just getting used to these words, hearing the concepts, and then you know, with purification and meditation every day, slowly these words the bells start to ring, you know, the penny drops. We get to hear the meaning. But if you start saying the wrong words, you'll never get the right meaning. I mean, you can say 1 + 1 is 3 for 40 million eons. You'll never get the truth, ever. You've got to say the right words first. Of course, Mahamudra is a very different approach. It's more experiential, but this is crucial. We can see it in ordinary daily life. We've got to have clarity, you know. Have the meaning of words, use them properly, string them together in the correct sentence, and slowly the meaning comes. That's how we learn everything. So the other one is the subtlest meaning of the subtlest meaning of emptiness. We haven't got to that yet. So as His Holiness said, the I isn't empty. Okay, there are various synonyms for the word. The shorthand is emptiness. It means empty of existing from its own side, empty of independent existence, empty of inherent existence, empty of self-existence, empty of existing in and of itself. There are many synonyms, many. Can you make up more? So emptiness is a word that refers to all of those. Certainly for the Prasangika Madhyamika view, they've got different things. So, what was I about to say? I forget now. Oh, yeah. So there's different levels of dependent arising. First of all, everything exists, all impermanent phenomena, I exist in dependence upon causes. That's karma, perfect. Second, more subtle, which we discussed, I exists in dependence upon parts, bits and pieces. And that's the analysis we have to do, which we did a bit. And there's still not all of it done there either. There's still something else we didn't do. The third one, the final one, the real meaning is emptiness. The I is empty of existing separately from the mind that cognizes it. So, as His Holiness says, the I isn't empty of existing inherently or independently because you can't find an I, and you won't find an I, but that's not the real premise. The I is empty of existing independently because it's a dependent arising. That's the real meaning. So until we get to that, we haven't done enough work. So, and that's the level at which Lama Zopa only ever teaches subtle dependent arising, merely labeled. So this is said to be more subtle and more difficult to understand, but in some ways, when we talk about other phenomena, it almost seems easier. So let's just talk about the phenomena of the world, because everything exists in the same way. And there's nothing that exists from its own side. There's nothing that isn't empty of independent existence. There's nothing that isn't a dependent arising. So let's just use something simple like, say, a prison. That's a good example because there are lots of people in prison who have been able to change their label of prison and thus learn to be happy. And this is the whole practice we have in the Mahayana path. We learn to like problems like we like ice cream. All that's doing is stopping believing in the label problem. We label things, I'm going to get prison, but label, that's a problem. But problem, what's a problem? A problem is a thing that my attachment doesn't like. So I label it a problem. So then prison, think of prison, such a great example. So let's just give a definition of a prison, like a conventional truth. I would say a good definition of prison, at least the ones I've seen, it's an ugly place where you're sent when you're naughty and you can't escape from it. That would do. Except, of course, I always quote my friend in Norway a couple of years ago, emailed me. He was so excited about going to a prison for a couple of years. He couldn't wait. It was in the country. It was like he's going to get education. He's going to learn how to have had a vegetable garden. It was like he was looking forward to his 2 years in prison, because that's in Norway. So, better go to prison, go to Norway, okay? They get nicer as you keep heading north on the planet, it seems. So, so conventionally, this is the point, this is the thing, conventionally, okay, this is the point. Emptiness doesn't contradict conventional reality. We think it does. So conventionally, the definition is a prison, that ugly building, and they're mostly ugly ones I've been to, you know, and you're sent there because you're naughty, and they're ugly, usually ugly, and the noise is shocking, and the food is pretty disgusting. Usually the ones I've been to, but there can be some others. That's a pretty good example of a prison. Now, that's conventionally a fact. Now, our problem is we have this view of emptiness, and we go, oh, well, it's all empty anyway, so, you know, it doesn't matter. That's a nihilistic statement. This is not like that. The correct statement is prison, you know, this prison, this ugly dump where you're sent when you're naughty that you can't escape from, is conventionally true. But it doesn't have those characteristics intrinsically. So if it did, if prison, if those bricks and that mortar and those cells and those guards and that barbed wire, if they had an intrinsic, inherent character of being an ugly place where you're sent when you're naughty and you can't escape from, which is conventionally true, but if it had an intrinsic nature of this, then my friends who have chosen to be happy while they're in prison could not possibly ever be happy. So why you can learn to be happy with a garbage situation, with a problem, is because it doesn't have an intrinsic character of being a problem. Conventionally, yes, your boyfriend leaving you, getting cancer, a war zone, the bad things that all happen to us are conventionally what we would call an unhappy situation. They have a conventional reality, but what we do is we overlay an absolute character on top of them, and we see them as intrinsically that. That's the problem. So then when we make a nihilistic mistake, we then think, oh, well, it doesn't have it's empty of existing from its own side in that way, so therefore it doesn't matter. It doesn't really exist. That's nihilism, and we can't help but go to that. And that's the mistake. We're chucking the baby out with the bathwater. We're falling into the abyss of the great mistake. So emptiness reaffirms existence, and dependent arising reaffirms emptiness. This is the point we have to get to understand this even theoretically. So the merely labeled is very obvious. It's very clear. Ramsey always uses these simple examples. He used the example of learning the alphabet. A. Your teacher writes it on the board in front of you, first time you've seen it. And it's, you know, these design, there's 3 pieces, there's this, and there's one going across. Now it's very simple, it's very obvious. You didn't know it was A until your teacher told you. That proves it's not intrinsically A. If it were intrinsically, inherently, in and of itself, from its own side, out there, existing in itself, A, you'd know it as soon as you saw it. I've got some Tibetan words in front of me on my wall in front of me. I've never learned Tibetan. People tell me it means Om Mani Padme Hum. It's very embarrassing. After 45 years, I still can't see Om Mani Padme Hum there, but I can't. I see pretty shapes, you know. So if it were inherently Om Mani Padme Hum, if it were inherent, I'd read it immediately. This is so obvious. It's so clear. I mean, you know, if a person didn't know, let's say a person's been living in a garbage dump in some kind of sewer and they got sent to prison, she would think she's in paradise. Even the crummiest prison would be heaven after a sewer. But if she's never known it's called prison, she'd wake up every day. She wouldn't want to get outside the front door. I'm happy. Thank you very much. Bring me my meals. I'm fine. She'll think she's in heaven. You go to prison in Norway, excuse me. So things have a conventional truth. This is a very precise, important thing. The thermos, you've got to establish it is a flat-bottomed metal container that keeps my tea warm. You've got to prove that is true. Then you can begin to discuss how it hasn't got that nature intrinsically. And so it's to bring these two together, not to see them as a contradiction. That's the big mistake we make. We can't help but hear it like that. So merely labeled. That's the conventional, the subtle dependent arising, they say. And they say that at the subtlest level, once you realize the emptiness of the I in terms of the parts, you then get to realize emptiness, and then you realize dependent arising, subtle dependent arising. It's merely labeled. That's the final conclusion to come to. Merely labeled. You finally see the conventional truth after you've seen the emptiness. If you just leave it as being empty of an independent I, of independent of the parts, you haven't gone far enough. You've got to realize emptiness and then realize it's merely labeled. That's the final piece to do. That's what His Holiness said. Any other questions? And everything has this character. There's nothing that doesn't exist like this. Nothing could exist this way. That's what Buddha's pointing out. It's not possible. And this is where when you study all the Buddhist tenets, the different views that have been cultivated in Buddhism over the centuries in India, you're going to find that all the views, there's 4 schools of Buddhism, and even among those, there's many different branches of these different views that have been cultivated over the centuries. And all of them, up to the final one, which is what one we're discussing here, the Prasangika Madhyamika view, they all posit there has to be something there that is the basis of the label. There has to be something that you can point to. And the Prasangika Madhyamika says, no, you don't need. It can't be. It can't be anything inherent. Not possible. Impossible. Any questions, folks? So then we're going to ask, well, what's the point of all this? How's this helping me? Well, it's getting to the root of all the problem, which is the belief in the intrinsic me, which of course we can't see. That's why there's attachment. That's why there's anger. That's why there's depression. That's why there's this me and you and up and down and yo-yo and all the dramas. You know, it's because of they're held by the root. So as soon as you cut the root, the others collapse. As soon as you cut the root, the branches collapse. There's no basis. This is hard to conceive. It's hard to imagine. That's why I always tell that lovely story about Baba Zopa. Did I tell that story here? I tell it everywhere. When he, is drowning. I told that story here for this group or not? Andrew, do you remember that story or not? Andrew?
I don't think you've told it during these teachings, but I have heard it in the past.
It's a really good one, because when you realize emptiness, there's no fear. That's Lama Yeshe says the same thing in Mahamudra. This is something very shocking to hear, because when we start to look into the Buddhist view of the mind, we're going to start to see it's true that ego grasping, the sense of a self, and then the attachment and the anger and all the other dramas are all rooted in fear, anxiety, worry, fear, panic. That's their flavor. So once you've realized, and this comes gradually. It's not as if you're a maniac one day and you realize emptiness the next. It's an ongoing evolutionary process, Even as you start to control your body and speech, you get less neurotic. Then you start to control your delusions, you get less neurotic. Then you add bodhicitta, you get completely less neurotic. And then by the time you realize emptiness, you're in bliss. It's an ongoing process. So the story of Rinpoche, he was said to be the reincarnation of a previous yogi up in the mountains, a Sherpa, Nyingma yogi, Kunsang Yeshe. And anyway, he the last 20, 30 years of his life, I can't remember, maybe 20 years of his life, he was in a cave, the Laudo cave, it was up in the mountains, he was a Sherpa, and he was meditating there, and then he a tantric yogi, and he died with complete control. These yogis can do that with complete control over it and chooses his rebirth. So anyway, he's reborn, this little boy. He wasn't called Zopa at the time. I don't know what his name was, but his sister talks about, how he was very unusual and acted differently. And when he played games, he acted the role of a lama and always made mud pie dojis and mud pie bells, and just talked about his benefactors coming to his pujas, all his past life benefactors, stated all their names and everything. Anyway, he got recognized eventually when he was a little boy, 8 or 7 or something. He was recognized by the local lama as the reincarnation of the Laudo Lama, Kunsang Yeshe. So anyway, at some point he was sent off up to the mountains, further up the mountains, and he had this manager, they call him manager, was taking care of him, So and there was this big river. He was about 8 at the time, 1952, he was 8. So he was this big river, and on the other side of the river, there were these strange looking people, pale eyes, straw-colored hair. Sounds like Swedish people, doesn't it? But they're white people, obviously, He'd never met white people before, and he wanted to meet them. So he decides to go across the bridge, and his manager's a bit nervous, but he brings his bowl of potatoes, that's the staple for the Sherpas, as a gift. And he goes across the bridge and he falls in the water with his potatoes, you know. So of course they don't teach them swimming up there, and he's drowning. So this is how he told the story. He said, the head kept coming to the surface. Now, check how we would talk. This is how they talk when you start to look, even when they talk in general about how you look into your mind. You don't say, I am angry. You say, there is anger, there is love, you've got to be more objective, you know. And this is a very good practice, because this is not I, this is the body. So, you know, we'd say, I came to the surface for air. He said, the head came to surface. He saw the manager freaking out, running along the bank, you know. So anyway, he then said to himself, the person known as the Laudo Lama is about to die. And then in his comment about him, when he's telling the story, he said, I didn't know anything about emptiness. Meaning in that life, he was 80, never heard the teachings, but there was no fear. So it's clear, we can see from this, as evident, that there was no ego grasping. Because when there's no, I mean, ego grasping, the root delusion, and I find this very interesting, Mr. Darwin, I think, wasn't it, who called it instinct for survival. All this analysis we've given, you observe animals and humans, and when they've got in a tough situation, you know, we have this instinct of survival, to, you know, flight or whatever they call it, that business. Well, you know, and then we all have assumed scientifically that this is necessary. That's how we label. We've discovered, we've invented that philosophy. Well, Buddha says, what a load of rubbish. Instinct for survival is a great term, as far as I'm concerned, for ego grasping, for believing in an intrinsic me. So if Lama Zopa had been who he was, had chosen his new rebirth, had realized emptiness, not to mention bodhicitta, then they couldn't, because once you realize emptiness, you can never lose it in 10 trillion years. You can even lose bodhicitta. You cannot lose emptiness, because you've cut the root. It can't come back. You've burned the seed. It can't ripen again. There was no fear. So that means it's very fascinating. We think if there's no fear, he would have sort of sunk to the bottom of the river like a stone, isn't it? We think you have to have this panic to make you want to come to the surface. Buddha says, what a load of rubbish. That's just called ignorance and stupidity. You just need wisdom, not ignorance. So when there's no ego grasping, there is no fear. So even if he did drown, his mind would not have been disturbed. This is inconceivable for us if we think of modern psychology. There is no equivalent of such a state of mind. There's no evidence among normal people that this is a possibility. But this is the Buddhist view. So it's very encouraging. As Lama Yeshe said, you know, when you realize emptiness, there's no fear. And there's no longer the separate sense of self. There's just this bliss. It sounds so weird to us. And there's also compassion, naturally, and empathy, connectedness to others. It's very powerful. So I'm looking forward to realizing emptiness. Thank you very much. No fear. Think of it. But I mean, this is gradual. Analyze your own lives. What do you think fear is? I mean, look when we're angry. Look when we're jealous. Look when we're depressed. We're having panic attacks all the time. They're panic attacks. Look at them. Look at a person being angry. We'll just say, oh, look at her, she's angry. But she's having a serious panic attack, screaming, her eyes wide, irrational words coming out of her mouth. If that's not panic, I don't know what is. Complete panic because the eye is not getting what it wants. If you no longer believe in an intrinsic eye, a separate eye, an independent eye, a fantasy eye, there can't be fear. You're still not stupid. Lama Zopa knows his eye. He knows he's Lama Zopa. He's not stupid. He doesn't think he's a fish or anything. He knows who he is, but there's no grasping in his mind at anything intrinsic, therefore no attachment, therefore no anger. But he's got intelligence, and that means reasonable. Try and get up to the surface. It doesn't have to be delusions to cause you to do that. It's just common sense. I find that a very helpful story. So something to look forward to, folks. Keep moving. It's time to go. Andrew, is it? We've finished all together, haven't we?
Yeah, that concludes it. It was a great month.
So that's an upbeat sort of way to conclude. Let's just say a couple of nice little prayers. Let's just say a couple of nice little prayers. Put a couple of prayers up. Okay, so then we'll say these ones and we'll say some others as well. So due to the, I'm going to make extra words, okay? So due to all the virtuous karma, the karmic imprints that we put into our mind since we started this series of classes, every millisecond has been a karma we've created. Due to all of these, may we quickly become a Buddha, oneness with our guru, so that then we're able to lead every single suffering sentient being to that same state. And then may the supreme jewel bodhicitta, this amazing aspiration on the basis of compassion and love, to never give up benefiting sentient beings, that has not arisen in the minds of others, may it arise and grow, and then which has arisen, may it never diminish and may it increase more and more. And may the supreme jewel, the realization of emptiness that has not arisen, arise and grow in the minds of beings. And may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more and more. What else there? What else have you got? Andrew?
Venerable Robina?
Yes.
Hi, this is Carly.
Hello, Carly. Hello, sweetheart. Happy to see you.
Yeah, on behalf of Gampo Ludup, I would like to offer you a kata, and we will be sending you a monetary offering as well. We really appreciate you taking the time, and we really love your direct and clear teachings and learn so much every time. So we would like to invite you back many, many times, and I hope you live forever and continue to teach.
Thank you, Carly. I'm happy I'm coming, and I'm happy to come back to real Laguna Beach one day. I remember it vividly. Yes. Thank you, precious ones. And may all our lamas live long. May the Dalai Lama live long and Lama Zopa live long and all our lamas live long, long, long lives. Okay, so the world needs them badly. And we should live long too. If we're practicing virtue, then we should live long. So never give up, okay, people? Thank you, precious ones, all of you. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Carly. Thank you, everybody. Much, much love, okay? See you soon. Thank you, darling.
So much, Venerable Robina.
Keep moving. The wonderful work you're doing in Laguna Beach.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
More
Thank you,
blessings.
Venerable.
Thank you so much, Robina. Thank you very much for
Great.
Thank you, everybody, for hosting, and thank you, everybody, for everything. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.